Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back once again to our lessons on the Gunpowder Empires. Today we have a pretty short one. Of all the days for me to be absent or have to do remote learning as a makeup, this was a pretty good day to have it happen. Today we got a pretty short lesson on the Gunpowder Empires, which is a mini unit that we've been talking about. We talked about the Mughals last time, and now we're going to talk about the Safavids. If you're wondering, how do I spell Safavid? Here it is. Safavid Empire, you'll note, is roughly contemporary with the Mughals. Technically, it predates it a little and it falls a little bit before it. But again, for a lot of time, these guys are going to be coexistent with the Mughals. They're not going to interact with them nearly as much as with the Ottomans. The Mughals are kind of the odd man out in that regard, but they are still going to be significant. Okay, the Safavid Empire's origins are, and you're going to hear me say this a lot today, and I apologize, way too complicated for me to explain with the amount of time I have and with the amount of information I have. They start out with a Sufi group. We talked about the Sufis last time. The Sufis, remember, are this very mystical, very spiritual form of Islam called the Safaviya, I believe is the pronunciation there. I apologize. I probably butchered that. And while they form as a Sufi group, they're eventually going to adopt a different form of Islam, one that is, if not more familiar, at least one that will be the focus of most of today. The Mongols, as we talked about, eventually, after conquering Persia, eventually fall apart. Another group called the Timurids, who we don't talk about, but who were just awful, awful group. Iran had a rough run between the Mongols and the Timurids. Those guys conquer the region and then they kind of fall away or fade away. Persia is a politically divided locale prior to the arrival of the Safavids. The Safavids technically early on only controlled about the Caucasus region, about what I've just circled there, but eventually they're able to unify under their king, and the only person I think we mentioned by name in this entire lesson, Ismail I, who is both a fantastic general as well as a Shia Muslim. And you do need to know that last bit. This is, for our class, until we get to modern Iran, the most major Shia empire that we're going to look at. Okay, so you'll notice I don't really want you to write this down. Here's the thing. Over the course of the next little bit, this is our principal focus for the lesson. I am going to try to talk to you about the split between Sunni and Shia Islam, as well as tying Islamic national identity and ethnic identity to what form of Islam you practice. Understand. This course is already in so many ways an oversimplification of so many aspects of history, and in this case, it's hyper oversimplification. To properly explain this sort of stuff would require a degree I don't have, studies I have not been able to do, as well as several days worth of classes. I don't have any of that. You are getting a very simplified version. I will send you more sources if you're curious about them, but for right now, understand you are getting the Cliff's Notes version of the Sunni Shia split, and I do apologize for that, but the level of depth required is not one which I possess. All right, the big difference between the Safavid Empire and, like I said, literally every other Muslim state we look at with any detail in here, except for modern Iran, is the type of Islam they practice. They are ethnically Turkic. They are the same ethnicity, though not the same tribe as the bunch that forms the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire, but they practice Shia Islam. Shia is the form of Islam that is practiced by the numbers I've looked up most recently say about 15% of all Muslims today. And Shia is not only is it the minority form when compared to Sunni Islam, it's also geographically pretty much exclusively located in Iran and Iraq. There are small Shia communities elsewhere in Afghanistan, in Yemen. There are Shia Muslims here in the United States, but almost all of them are of Iraqi or Iranian descent. Shia Islam started way, way back in the 700s with the death of Muhammad, excuse me, the 600s, with the death of Muhammad and a dispute over who should be the leader of Islam. Shia Muslims made the statement that the caliphate, that the title of successor to Muhammad should be passed down through Muhammad's bloodline, starting with his son-in-law and going on down that direction. Sunni Muslims thought that it should it should go to a properly chosen person, somebody who was close to Muhammad, somebody who obeys his teachings and rules very passionately, etc., etc. Not that Muhammad's son-in-law didn't. Over the years, what started out as, I don't want to say a minor dispute, because fairly obviously it created two major branches of Islam, the two major branches of Islam. Um, but this dispute gets wider and wider and wider as the years go on. And eventually, Shia Muslims come to believe that they are defending the real version of Islam. I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to get into all the minor details of it, but there's a lot of beliefs and practices that the Shia Muslims do that are not the same as Sunni Muslims, that Shia follows this much more correct in their mind tradition than Sunni Islam, which is in their eyes a very stagnant and politicized version of their religion. Okay. Um, as a general rule, the Sunni Shia split kind of got pushed into the sidelines when the Mongols showed up because, especially in Persia, the Mongol invasion was more or less a war of extinction. I actually looked up today while researching this. There's some studies that suggest Iran lost somewhere in the ballpark of 90% of its population during the Mongol invasion. It was really bad in Persia, guys. The establishment of the Safavid nation, though, the establishment of the Safavid Empire in the 1500s, ended Sunni Shia cooperation more or less permanently. The Safavids forcibly converted this region that they controlled, most of which is now modern Iran, into being Shia. And even today, Iran is where the Shia heartland is. You can see, based on the percentages, looking at this map, the darker the green, the higher percentage is Shia Muslim. This is a map of the Islamic world. Notice that the only nation that is really dark green is Iran. Um, and here's the other thing. Because the people who live in what is now Iran, this is going back to an old trap that is easy to fall into if you are an American, especially not an Islamic American. Um, Islam's a religion. It has a lot of different ethnicities in it. The people of Iran are ethnically Persian. And what happens is the identity of being Persian becomes tied to being a Shia Muslim. So, Persian Shias up against Sunni Arabs and Turks, and that's people from Turkey, not the Turkic that we've talked about, that becomes a consistent dividing line literally up to the present day. If you haven't looked it up, it's really worth a look up to make your world bigger, to understand bigger things. Right now, the Middle East is more or less divided into two spheres of influence between the Sunni Arab Saudi Arabians and the Shia Persian Iranians. They still don't like each other. They're still constantly fighting. ISIS, ISIL, the Islamic State, whatever you want to call them, they were hardline Sunni Muslims, and they killed with regularity, yes, Westerners, yes, Christians, Jews, Yazdis. They also targeted Shia Muslims because they hated them too. They considered them to be just as blasphemous as these other religions. It is a deep running rivalry, and it starts with the rivalry between the two great empires of the Safavids and the Ottomans. These groups, the Safavids and the Ottomans, fought a series of wars more or less from 1534 to 1736, though there was a break in the middle there of about 100 years between 1639 and 1730. And these are highly destructive conflicts. The Safavid Ottoman Wars, which changed very little territorially, were extremely violent conflicts. They deepened the Sunni Shia split even more. They inflame ethnic tensions. By the end of it all, there's basically no Persians living in the Ottoman Empire, and there's basically no Arabs living in the Safavid Empire. But it does come with a weird positive. And like so many wars in this class, they really, like I said, do not accomplish very much except spending a whole lot of money and lives and changing very little territory. Um, the Europeans who bordered the Ottomans followed a very simple policy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the Safavids, who knew that, reached out to them a couple of times. And as a result, the Safavids and many European states, especially Habsburg Austria, had pretty good relations because you had the Safavids on one side, the Ottomans on the other side. The Safavids on one side, the Habsburgs on the other side of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire sandwiched between those two. Why wouldn't you work together with them to limit their expansion and influence? And as a result, the Safavids actually had pretty good relations, like I said, especially with the Habsburgs, but also with the Habsburg rulers of Spain, with the French king Louis XIV. And the Safavids, while they still taxed them, while they were still not anywhere near the same level as the Shia Muslims, the Safavids treated their Christian subjects better than they did their Sunni or Jewish or a very small number of Zoroastrian subjects. And that's a big deal. The Safavids would merge art and architecture with the locals. Here's a lovely mosque in I believe it's Isfahan. Obviously, it's in Iran somewhere. Forgive me, I've forgotten where that one was. And Persia, who had this long artistic tradition, predating Islam, predating Christianity, predating so much. Persia, remember, was one of those classical civilizations we talked about way, way back at the start of class. Persia now has this artistic tradition that is being used more or less to propagandize the Shia worldview. It's us against the world, we're the proper form of Islam. Hey, look at this beautiful tomb we built. Look at this beautiful mosque we built. Look at the calligraphy in this Quran. And Persian art continues to be drawn in a realistic, almost idealized fashion, something they had done literally since the days of Darius and Xerxes. A big piece of that is you guys are probably familiar with the fact that most Muslims consider it to be verboten, very bad to draw the Prophet Muhammad. While Shia Muslims aren't like drawing Muhammad all over everything, they are substantially less strict about that process. Architecturally speaking, Safavid mosques and palaces will blend together Arab architecture and Persian architecture. You can see that here. You'll notice a few minor differences between that and the Mughal architecture we looked at last time. That's the sort of thing we're talking about here. Okay, because of its location, the Safavids do continue being a link on the newly revived Silk Road. Europeans are going to come to dominate global trade, especially in the Atlantic, obviously, but also with the Indian Ocean, they're going to move into and gobble up more and more and more of that as the 1500s and 1600s go on. And the Safavids, they knew which way the wind was blowing, and so they would work with different groups, especially the Armenians who practiced Christianity throughout the Safavid Empire. And even though the Silk Road trade kind of starts to go downhill as oceanic trade became more and more and more popular, the Safavids were still able to make a decent living through the trade of Persian artworks, Persian silks, that sort of thing. In fact, and this runs very heavily counter to the way Americans frequently perceive Iran. This is an Armenian Christian cathedral called the Vank, or the Vank, I'm really not sure how it's pronounced, that is in Isfahan, and it's still operating today. It's a Christian church operating in the Shia heartland. Very impressive stuff here. Of course, good things fall apart. Good song, by the way. The Safavids, especially after their last great ruler, Abbas I, became more and more interested in personal luxuries. A lot of them became drunks, just like what we saw with the Ottomans, as well as personal pleasure than the running of their empire. Outside groups begin to tear away chunks of the empire. The Russians invade, the Afghans rebel, the Georgians, again from what is the country of Georgia, not like, hi y'all, they begin to break away, and the empire falls apart relatively quickly, and from the next couple hundred years, Persia is going to be politically disunified and politically weak. We won't be revisiting Persia/Iran again for a while. All right, thanks for sticking with. Hopefully that was not too overwhelming. I know most of it was focused on the Sunni-Shia split. Next time we get to look at the Ottomans, probably the most familiar of the gunpowder empires, and definitely one of my favorites, if only because of so much cool stuff and how long that empire lasted. Okay, have a great weekend. I will see you all in the future. Bye-bye.